Okay, so this is my short keynote, very short keynote lecture that I put together on our Unit 2 topic. It's the last topic in Unit 2, and it's from our textbook, Chapter 13, and that is what we call feudalism. It's from Section 2 of Chapter 13. So I suggest watching this keynote prior to your reading from the text. Okay, so the period that immediately precedes the Renaissance is called the Middle Ages. It wasn't given that name, Middle Ages, until the 1800s. Back in the 19th century, historians began referring to it as the Middle Ages. Prior to that time, the people who lived at that time, basically 1100 to 1450, had no idea they were living in the Middle Ages. For them, it was the present, but we call it medieval Europe or Middle Ages, okay? And what we're going to talk about in our next slide is what we call feudalism. So feudalism is basically talking about the social history of and economic history of that time period. It's an interesting topic, feudalism, and it's basically that society throughout Europe at the time was shaped by what we call the feudal system. Often it's called feudalism, but it's better to call it the feudal system. And the feudal system was based on land ownership and how land ownership determined one's status. Okay, feudal comes from the Latin word feudum, and what that meant was a land holding, something what's called a fief or a land holding. So the feudal system linked aristocrats or nobles together in an arrangement. Land was basically given to them by the king in exchange for their loyalty. Now, within this feudal structure, you found members of other European social groups, various walks of life, general laborers, people who took care of like the farm animals and that kind of thing. You also had merchants, you had artisans, professionals. Back in the Middle Ages, if you were a lawyer or if you were a doctor, you were a professional, okay? So a word that we often associate with medieval feudalism is peasants, and many people today, they tend to think that peasants back then were all dirty, poor, and very uneducated, and that's not quite so. Back then, the word peasant did not necessarily mean poor. Peasant was not an economic term, it was a social structure from this feudal system.